In 2003, the United States government and a wacky coalition of whoever felt comfortable lying to their people invaded Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein. By 2005, Saddam had been captured, the Battle of Fallujah had been won, and Baghdad was in coalition control. At this time, Brigadier General Karl Horst was deputy commander of the 3rd Infantry Division and was put in charge of security in and around Baghdad. As this was happening, PMCs, or private military contractors, were being employed to patrol and maintain security in Iraq, but many said that they lacked the proper accountability that usually comes from a formal military. A view that was agreed with by Karl Horst, who said that, quote, "These guys run loose in this country and do stupid stuff. There's no authority over them, so you can't come down on them hard when they escalate force. They shoot people, and someone else has to deal with the aftermath. It happens all over the place."
Ladies, gentlemen, federal agents wondering why I was so interested in the Wagner Group for the past year, welcome to the Mercenary Moments Iceberg, a list of mercenaries or PMCs doing wacky, quirky, brutal, or uncharacteristic things. To begin, although I'm sure most of you know what an iceberg chart is, we are on YouTube after all, I decided to not put all the more disturbing things at the bottom of the list, because although it would show the crimes that line of work has committed, some of those crimes are more well known than others. There are also bundles of things that are on this list. This is just because I noticed that some groups were doing a bunch of small things that were all kind of on the same tier, or there were a bunch of similar things that all didn't deserve its own section. It also just makes the video go smoother. Anyway, let's begin. The first part of this video revolves around terminology. In the modern day, the term mercenary is rarely used, and has instead been replaced by PMC, meaning I've done this before. Private military contractor.
This has been done for two main legal reasons. The first is that the Geneva Convention says that mercenaries are not recognized as legitimate combatants, and therefore do not have to be given the same legal protections as other captured soldiers. And so, a need to blur the line between types of combatants began for some governments. The second is the International Convention against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, which really gets straight to the point. This was a convention that was adopted in 2001, and therefore the need for PMCs was expedited to try to get around the rules that the convention created, mostly because governments or some private entities still wanted the services that they provide. These two things, along with the stigma against using mercenaries, made the term PMC come into prominence, so that people could hire mercenaries without hiring mercenaries.
Another thing that I should explain is not every foreign fighter is a mercenary or PMC.
There are plenty of examples of people going to fight for a country that they're not part of for ideological reasons, but I'm not going to mention these as I'm trying to keep this video about mercenaries. Of course, this is still a pretty blurry line. Many PMCs and historically mercenaries have said that a large reason for joining was ideological, and that they felt that their contract was the best way to achieve their goals. So for this list, a large part of it is personal opinion on who is and isn't a mercenary.
My process for distinguishing this can be explained in two hypothetical examples. This is Burginistan. It's beautiful, I know. Unfortunately, it's been embroiled in a civil war for the past 27 years.
If someone from the US were to join a paramilitary faction in Burginistan because they think it's the right thing to do, even if they got paid a quite generous 12 Burginistani shekels per month, I wouldn't call them a PMC, because they could have gotten paid much more being like a cashier at Safeway. That being said, if a company in the UK was hired by the interim Burginistani government to protect oil fields, or fight rebels, and someone from Norway was being paid $27,000 per month to go there and do that, it's not a stretch to say that they're a PMC, or as previously mentioned, a mercenary.
Again, nothing is cut and dry. One person's mercenary is another person's freedom-fighting patriot. Generally, it's just I've been looking at articles and then squinting and then deciding if they count as mercenaries or not. Moving on to the next tier, it's just sort of more homework I have to do, just kind of PMCs and mercenaries in media and the effect that they have had on real life. This is just because, it would take too long to cover them all.
Just to go over some of these, this includes USEC, Bear, Merryweather, Murkywater, the main character from Far Cry 2, technically speaking Paw Patrol, whatever's going on in the new Call of Duty story and the new Battlefield story, the third funniest faction to join a squad, the reason to be a human nationalist from Avatar, and probably a bunch of other examples because, as that list showed, I have the media consumption habits of 2013 4chan. Mercenaries are often seen in media for a few reasons. The first is that they're pretty interesting. Done well, you can write a story that involves them that would be very difficult to tell using conventional militaries. The second is that they're fairly easy to give a reason for their actions, and the final reason is that they can act as a stand-in for a bad guy if a writer feels uncomfortable calling someone a bad guy. Meaning that you can avoid the controversy of having an antagonist Western force, or avoid the stereotypical Russian military bad guy while changing very little about the story. This section also includes members of actual militaries who reference these pieces of media, my personal favorite being people wearing USEC patches while fighting in Ukraine.
Detroit Urban Survival Training is a company run by Detroit resident Dale Brown, and, as the name suggests, provides training to people in Detroit because it's a war zone. It got popular online a few years ago because of how absurd some of the advice is, to the point it could very well get you killed. What most people don't know is that Dale Brown ran a separate company called Detroit Threat Management.
This provides security to certain Detroit areas and businesses. There are quite a few reasons that he's able to drive around Detroit looking like a low-budget action movie, with the first being that the Detroit police have been accused of unconstitutional conduct, which has led to them being defunded and less police officers. The second is that the city of Detroit had to file for bankruptcy, which led to an increase in crime, leading to some people moving towards services like the one Dale Brown provides. Two other things that I found while doing research for this is that in an interview, he said that if Chris Kyle, the American sniper, took his 30-minute LARP sesh, then he would still be alive. Also, he now sometimes appears on Fox News.
This is why I made the video. It's just, it's crazy, right? I need to talk about it now. We're gonna talk about it. Let's begin.
The Wagner Group is a Russian PMC that was started by Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was close to the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, by first being his private chef. At its start, Wagner was very successful, despite the fact that Russian law explicitly prohibits, quote, illegal armed formations and mercenary groups. Originally, they did work around the world, wherever the Russian government wanted them to. We'll talk about their shenanigans in this period later, but this story starts in 2022, when Vladimir Putin decided to restart his war in Europe. This didn't go ideally for his second strongest military in the world, so Vlad, or more realistically, someone in the Russian government, called up Wagner to help them out, and so they began aggressively recruiting and went off to war. This led to the Wagner Group fighting in some of the most brutal parts of the conflict, with the most well-known being the Battle of Bakhmut, which they won, making them very well known in Russia. During these battles, Wagner had to endure heavy casualties, leading to Prigozhin openly blaming some members of the Russian government for the military failures in Ukraine, and sometimes threatening to withdraw troops as leverage to get more supplies. The most well-known example of this is the video where he shouted in front of dead Wagner soldiers that they died because his troops had a 70% shortage of ammunition, and the fault of that lied with Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. As the war went on, resentment from Prigozhin grew because of what he saw as corruption in the Russian government. Then, on the 23rd, Prigozhin claimed that the Russian military had bombed Wagner troops, allegedly killing hundreds, a claim which of course the Russian government denied. With all this as the background, and Prigozhin being a leader willing to take risks that no one else was, on June 23rd, he decided to try a different negotiating strategy. Coup d'etat! He said that his only goals were to get rid of corruption in the MOD and remove his two arch-enemies, but in reality, the coup was likely done because the military was planning to integrate Wagner into their command structure. It was also probably started early, as some sources say that the original plan was to capture Shoigu and Gerasimov during a planned visit to southern Russia, which is a much more reasonable plan compared to the 100 Wagner Spartans versus 10 bazillion MOD guards that he almost tried. That being said, apparently the Russian government discovered the plan 2 days before it happened, so he had to prematurely start the rebellion. Despite this, Wagner was originally able to make incredibly fast advancements, as most members of the Russian military thought it was another similar threat to the ones in the past that would be over before it even began. The clearest example of this is when Alexander Lukashenko said that both he and Putin slept through the initial phases of the rebellion because they thought it wasn't that bad and would be solved by the morning. This plan then gave Wagner time to seize the port city of Rostov-on-Don in Russia, where some military assets of the Russian government were located. Prigozhin then had an interview with the mayor of the town, in which he said, definitely out of his own beliefs, that what they were doing was a great idea, and that everyone was on board. After this, Vladimir Putin realized that coups are in fact bad, and appeared on a televised address not calling them out directly, but clearly condemning their actions. The Russian government then tried to attack Wagner with helicopters, which they repelled, and also began digging up roads and setting up buses to act as barricades to slow their advance to Moscow.
In the online world, it was insane. So insane, I have a hard time putting it into words. We were seeing a permanent member of the UN Security Council try to stop a coup during a war, all while we were getting updates minute by minute.
The conspiracies were very fast, with the most common being that the CIA had gotten to Mr. Pringle to get him to swap alliances. Along with this, there were videos being posted on both sides which didn't do anything to calm the situation. And by the end of the day, Wagner had gotten within a day's drive of Moscow, where I presume some group members texted some people not to show up to war meetings tomorrow. As this was happening, according to Wagner, the Russian government had killed hundreds of their troops, while according to the Russian government, the convoy had also made a few martyrs for them too. The stage was set. Both sides were armed. Both sides were ready to die for their cause, and the Russian nationalists were split on who to support. It was a sleepless night, as many thought that whatever violence occurred on the 23rd would be but the first drop of blood compared to the rivers that would flow on the 24th. For on that day, the siege of Moscow would begin. Alexander Lukashenko, the guy whose whole thing is being a dictator and trying to annoy Poland, what are you doing here? Prigozhin, this isn't you, bro. You're gonna die. Go screw around in Africa or something. I don't know. Yeah, okay, that sounds fun.
And that's how it ended. Everyone kind of just went back to their regularly scheduled war. Literally.
I still don't fully understand how he talked him down. A Wagner Telegram channel said that it was all part of the plan, and Lukashenko said that he basically just threatened him not to do it. After this, Prigozhin left to hang out in West Africa, and then died in an untimely and completely unrelated plane crash while going back to Moscow with many high-ranking members of the Wagner group. This is such a wacky part of their story, so we'll come back to it in other parts of the video, but for now, this is the most well-known part of their most insane story. During the 100 Years' War, many soldiers began to see being a soldier as a profession rather than a temporary activity, because as it turns out, you sometimes might see the thing that you're getting paid to do for over 20 years as a job. This then began a period that is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of Mercenaries. In this Golden Age, Switzerland became known for some of the most effective mercenaries that money could buy, being noted for their combat effectiveness using the phalanx, which is kind of just a lot of people with long pokey things packed tightly together. This was also convenient because you could often get entire mercenary armies by simply contacting the local governments, or cantons, of Switzerland. These mercenaries were frequently used by French kings, and were sometimes considered more reliable than French guards during times of political unrest. One example of this being how during the storming of the Bastille, a detachment of Swiss grenadiers was sent to reinforce the prison, but we all know how that ended. Despite this, they continued to make, as a historian at Cambridge put it, hella fat stacks of cash, fighting alongside French, Spanish, Dutch, and British armies, along with being recruited by the Vatican in the 1500s. This only really ended in 1874, when an amendment to the Swiss constitution banned the recruitment of Swiss citizens by foreign states, which also came about during the beginning of their now well-known policy of isolationism. But despite the official policy that mercenaries are illegal in Switzerland, one unit has been permitted, the Swiss Guard, meaning that the Vatican is still guarded by them, and making them the only army in Europe that has a long pokey thing as their primary weapon.
Machiavelli is the name of a diplomat, author, philosopher, and historian who lived during the Italian Renaissance during the end of the Golden Age of Mercenaries.
Machiavelli is predominantly known for his political ideas. Over the course of his books, he discusses his philosophy that went away from traditional Renaissance beliefs that a good leader is one that's kind, and instead believed that a good leader is one that knows how to defend and bring honor to the state. His work is a bit more complicated than this and covers a much larger range of topics, but this isn't about philosophy. Let's get into his opinions on mercenaries. Basically, don't use them. In one of his most famous quotes, he says that they're useless, dangerous, and that anyone who uses them to maintain power will not be able to stand firm or strong, and then goes on to insult them just a little bit more. This quote is often used to point out the risks of using private armies who are only loyal to money to maintain the status quo, a problem which we'll see a bit more of in this Iceberg. Anyway, this is sort of a mercenary moment because people quote it a bunch, and also he just really goes at them in this quote, which I kind of find funny. The Nisour Square Massacre, sometimes just referred to as the Blackwater Massacre, occurred on September 16, 2007, when members of Blackwater opened fire on Iraqi civilians, killing 17 and wounding 20. Just before noon, a car bomb exploded where Iraqi and US officials were meeting, and so, a Blackwater team, which went by the call sign Raven 23, was called to escort a US embassy convoy in Baghdad. This was a pretty frequent occurrence, because at the time, a significant percentage of military personnel in Iraq were PMCs or contractors, with one of the largest employers of them being Blackwater. At this point, Raven 23 took positions on the south side of Nisor Square. Shortly after, a woman and her adult son were approaching slowly, driving on the wrong side of the road, and ignored the police trying to stop them. When Raven 23 saw this, they fired warning shots at the car and then fired into it, while also deploying stun grenades to allegedly try to clear the scene. During this, an Iraqi policeman approached the car, but it kept rolling forward, which members of Raven 23 interpreted as confirmation that it was a car bomb. So, they opened fire on the car, killing its 2 occupants and the police officer nearby. At this point, the Iraqi police and army, having perceived the stun grenades as real grenades, and having witnessed them shoot a police officer, responded by firing on Blackwater. Then, after this, Blackwater opened fire on the square, leading to many civilians being killed during the confusion. Blackwater and the State Department claimed that the incident began because between 8 and 10 armed attackers opened fire on the group from multiple locations, dressed as civilians and Iraqi police, and that they tried to withdraw but were blocked. Blackwater also claimed that because of the damage and bullet holes in their car, their account would be proven to be true. But when the FBI tracked down the car, it was found to have been repaired, effectively destroying the evidence. That being said, other people who were there also cast doubt on that claim. After the shooting had ended, Raven 23 had killed 17 civilians and injured 20 more. In the aftermath, there were multiple attempts to prosecute the group in the US, with the last and largest being held in Washington, D.C. During this, eyewitnesses said that the group fired indiscriminately, with another claiming that a Blackwater employee didn't cease fire when told to stop, and only stopped when another Blackwater member pointed a gun at him. I should also mention that the trial was very controversial in how it was handled, with a frequently cited instance being some interesting claims of the prosecution. That being said, other courts still held up their convictions when appealed. In the end, Eric Prince, who was the founder and CEO of Blackwater, decided to sell the company, and although the last trial found 4 Blackwater employees guilty, they were pardoned in 2020 by Donald Trump. On one hand, you could say that they were pardoned because he disagreed with how the trial was handled, but on the other, you could point out that Eric Prince made significant contributions to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, and is the brother of Trump's once Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos.
Somalia is a country on the northeastern tip of Africa that has many coastal villages that traditionally relied on fishing for much of their existence. That being said, although the central government of Somalia was never particularly stable, starting around the 2000s they became very unstable because of a number of reasons. Long story short, this eventually led to foreign vessels coming into Somalian waters and overfishing them, because let's face it, what was the Somalian government gonna do?
This led many fishing villages to take up piracy in Somalian waters, not for profit, but as a threat to those overfishing, often kidnapping and demanding ransom as a form of punishment. This led to a decrease in illegal fishing, but as it turns out, being a pirate is a lot more profitable than being a fisherman, so many decided to take up the job full-time. As this happened, ships also began to move around Somalia, and so these pirates decided to expand their piracy beyond Somalian waters, as an essential trade route between Europe and Asia is literally right there. This strategy then rapidly expanded in popularity when Ethiopia invaded Somalia in 2006, meaning that the last restriction on their business, that being the government, effectively stopped existing. As you may have guessed, nobody liked this. Even if you can justify some I am vengeance justice for people overfishing, once you start openly messing with international trade, everyone quickly loses sympathy for your cause. Along with this, dealing with piracy is sort of a free-for-all. And by that, I mean, in international waters, you are legally allowed to use lethal force against them or arrest them and charge them under the laws of the country your ship is from. This led to quite a few countries getting involved to stop piracy, including the US, most European countries, China, Taiwan, Russia, India, Pakistan, and way more. Just for some context, it was so bad that at one point, a North Korean boat was taken by pirates and the US responded to help them. All the while, the North Koreans pulled off some dust tactics to reclaim their ship, meaning that, basically, the US and North Korea did a joint operation. Anyway, even with the successes of these state actions, there were still cases of piracy which companies needed to solve. So, instead of taking the much more expensive and long trip to Europe, they hired some private security to protect their boats. Generally speaking, the use of these PMCs in the ocean has greatly reduced the amount of piracy, because instead of playing catch-up as government organizations did, they instead were right alongside the target and were able to engage attackers immediately. Before the escalation in the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Wagner was a pretty elite group of military-trained PMCs, but after the invasion, Russia needed a lot more manpower to deal with the consequences of their actions, because the rest of the allotted troops were going through a few things. This made it so that the Wagner Group was allowed to recruit people in places that they usually wouldn't get to, such as recruiting in prisons. This was proven in a video released in 2022, which showed Prigozhin giving a halftime motivational speech to some of the convicts at this prison, promising them a pardon for their crimes after 6 months of fighting with them. This was shown to be real by both Ryan Macbeth, who you all probably know because short-form content makes brain go brrr, and the New York Times, who I'm mentioning because they did similar research at the same time and came to the same conclusion. The video was shown to be legitimate because everyone was wearing the correct Russian prison outfits. Many references would only make sense in the context of a Russian prison, and they were able to geolocate the prison to Yoshkar Ola Prison No. 6 in Russia.
Here comes the money!
Here we go!
The title of this part sort of just explains it. War is a racket, and oftentimes when governments go to mercenaries for help, they do so out of a soft desperation.
This makes it so these companies can charge much more and also get away with doing so. The clearest examples of this were during the global war on terror, where it was shown that these companies were charging exorbitant prices and oftentimes failing to provide quality services to the military. One example of this is how the military contractor KBR Halliburton, which specialized in military logistics, received contracts without bidding for them, meaning that they could charge whatever they wanted. Then it was found that they were cutting corners a lot, like failing to put chlorine into drinking and cleaning water, charging $45 for a 6-pack of Coca-Cola, charging $100 to clean a basket of laundry, and were instructing their truck drivers to drive around Iraq without anything in their trucks because the government would pay for it.
This overcharging has occurred in many other countries through many other businesses, and although I am sure there are some PMCs that are more efficient than standard militaries, as this is shown, others are very much not. Siegfried Müller, sometimes just referred to as Congo Müller, is the name of a Nazi tank gunner, mercenary, and subject of the East German documentary The Laughing Man, Confessions of a Murderer.
His story starts in World War II, when he joined the German army and fought in both the invasion of Poland and then Operation Barbarossa, leading him to fighting the Soviets for the rest of the war. During this time, he was promoted to first lieutenant and also earned an Iron Cross. Near the end of the war, he was non-fatally shot and then evacuated to Frankfurt, where he was captured by Americans, which is probably the best scenario for someone like him. After being released in 1947, he got a job clearing mines that were planted in the Sahara Desert during World War II. Later, he immigrated to South Africa, and in 1962 he became a mercenary, getting deployed into the Congo crisis to stop the Simba rebellion, because this is the Cold War and anything goes. During this, he was promoted and then noticed by journalists from Time magazine, because wearing an Iron Cross with a swastika in the middle might raise some questions. Eventually, he left the Congo and went back to South Africa, where he was found by an East German news crew who said they were from West Germany, got him absolutely plastered, and then convinced him to do an interview. This interview was pretty amazing for the East German news crews, because in it, he basically admitted to all the beliefs about the West that communist states already had. Some of these being that the West is clinging on to imperialism in Africa, mercenaries are being employed to defend Western values, they're okay with employing Nazis, and they frequently commit war crimes upon the local population. While admitting these things, he was also smiling, which you could say he didn't feel remorse for those things, but he was still hammered from the alcohol the news crew was giving him throughout the interview. As I said, this was such a great documentary for them that in East Germany it was frequently shown to students in school, which, along with the notoriety that the journalists reporting on the crisis gave him, made him an infamous and controversial figure around the world.
He also shows up in the Hearts of Iron mod, The New Order, or TNO.
On March 31st, 2004, a group of 4 Blackwater employees entered the city of Fallujah and were ambushed by insurgents who killed them all. After this, they were lit on fire and dragged through the streets, with 2 corpses being hung from a bridge. This incident, and the photos that came from it, led to the First and Second Battle of Fallujah, which led to some of the most violent street-to-street fighting of the entire Iraq War.
Wagner is sanctioned by a lot of people. Along with this, doing business with mercenary groups as a poorer country is often very difficult, considering that their local currencies are worth very little, and oftentimes the groups won't get paid if their leader gets Gaddafi'd or Ceausescu'd.
So, how do these states get around this problem? Well, one option is really old-fashioned bartering. They may not have a stable currency, foreign reserves, or their entire country for that matter, but they do have gold, diamonds, or oil that can be bartered in place of regular currencies. Wagner accepted this tactic to provide their services in places around the world, and got a much higher payout than simply receiving money for their actions. One of the largest examples of this occurred in the Central African Republic, where the central government employed a shell company of Wagner called Siwa Security Services, which helped protect the president and train the government's military. One way which they were paid to do this is with mining rights, the largest being the Ndasama mine, which was upgraded by them to be the only industrialized gold mine in the entire country. Another example of this is in Syria, where in 2015, as the Russian government helped Bashar al-Assad cling on to power, Wagner, using a shell company called Evropolis, was contracted to protect their oil fields.
Along with this protection, the contract Evropolis signed with the former Syrian government said that for every oil field they recaptured in the east of the country, they would receive 25% of the revenue. 25%! That is a ton of money. They were basically LARPing as Dick Cheney with this deal.
This is also why, in some cases, you'll see the term ISIS hunter in Wagner propaganda, because at that time, a lot of the oil fields in Syria were controlled by that terrorist group, which is also how they were so well funded. That being said, I should say they weren't just fighting ISIS, but we'll get back to that later. These are just two examples, but Wagner has used the same tactic in many other places in Africa and the Middle East, including Libya, Mali, Sudan, Mozambique, and Madagascar, allowing them to provide services in places that usually wouldn't be able to afford them, and allowing the Russian government to exert influence in those places without having to send over their troops.
Wagner is very different from other PMC groups. The most noticeable is that while other PMCs would try to distance themselves from violent events, unsavory actions, or if you don't care about what YouTube hears you say, war crimes, Wagner seems completely fine with that behavior.
The most well-known incident of this is a video in which they execute a member of Wagner named Yevgeny Nuzin using a sledgehammer. He was a member of Wagner who was recruited from prison and became a POW after surrendering to Ukrainian forces. Then, he was sent back to Russia for Ukrainians during a standard prisoner swap. After being sent back, he was captured by Wagner, accused of treason, and was then recorded being executed, with a video of this being uploaded online. Along with this, during Wagner's time in Syria, while working alongside the Rusich group, which, although some call a PMC, is more just a Russian paramilitary death squad, filmed a forcibly conscripted Syrian who they accused of being a jihadist being beaten to death, set on fire, and then beheaded. Although most companies would want to distance themselves from these things, members of Wagner's online circles have made these actions into symbols, morale patches, and propaganda, with their usage of this symbol also making its way into real life. For example, after Prigozhin was killed, some people brought sledgehammers to his memorial. Russian parliamentarians have posed with sledgehammers engraved with the group's logo, Russian ultranationalists have thrown sledgehammers at the Finnish embassy, and when the European Parliament designated the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism, Prigozhin sent a hammer covered in fake blood to the parliament, which I'm sure convinced them to rethink their decision.
In conclusion, Wagner uses warlord-esque summary executions to maintain their status of power, a fact which they seem proud of and make no attempt to hide.
Operation Gideon was a failed attempted coup of Venezuela committed by Venezuelan dissidents and the American PMC Silvercorp, which was attempting to cash out on the $15 million bounty placed on Nicolas Maduro by the US for drug trafficking and other crimes. Basically, Venezuela wasn't doing too hot for a variety of reasons. The main one being that the leaders basically gambled everything on oil profits going up, and then when they didn't, things got difficult. This then got even worse, with a contentious election that saw incumbent Nicolas Maduro winning another term. After this, and the US indictment on partying a little too hard, the CEO of Silvercorp, Jordan Goudreau, decided that the money from removing the president from power would be the best option to solve his financial problems, and also going down in history as the liberator of a country is always a nice bonus. That being said, the Venezuelan opposition government didn't feel too comfortable with how he was handling things, so he had to find another person to help him. To do this, he teamed up with Cliver Alcala, a former major general in the Venezuelan army, and Javier Nieto Quintero, who is one of the leaders of a network of Venezuelan soldiers who defected with the goal of removing the president from power. Alcala had a few dozen dissidents in a camp that were undertrained and underarmed, at which point Jordan said that he could begin training them, as PMCs usually help with that, leading him to hire 2 former Green Berets to help him. As the training montage began, the United States indicted Cliver Alcala on drug trafficking charges, and put a separate bounty on him for $10 million, at which point he turned himself into US authorities. Along with this, a truck full of guns and body armor was found by Venezuelan authorities, giving them a heads up that something might be happening.
After this, Venezuelan authorities arrested a member of the coup when he was visiting family, at which point he kind of just gave up the entirety of the plot, so much so that a Maduro ally went on TV and literally just told everyone how the coup was going to go, which isn't ideal if you want a surprise.
It should also be mentioned that Venezuela always knew that Javier was training dissidents, as in 2019, Venezuela mentioned in a debate at the UN the locations where they were training. Also, it's pretty well known now that the entire operation had been infiltrated by the Venezuelan government. The Associated Press knew that it was going to happen a few days beforehand, and according to some sources, a member of the CIA met with Jordan to tell him to not do the coup. Despite all these problems, training was still going on. I mean, Jordan wasn't there often and they were training with fake rifles made out of wood, but hey, that's probably not foreshadowing. Ignoring every sign that this maybe isn't a good idea, having no internal or external support, and having the entire plan doxed on TV, they decided to do it anyway. I mean, you've LARPed this hard, you might as well LARP a little more. They left from Colombia at night in 2 boats, one carrying around 46 people and the other carrying around 10, including the 2 Green Berets hired to train them for some reason. I guess they didn't want to miss out. The plan was to meet up with other dissidents and then do a bunch of different things. At this point, Jordan and Javier weren't anywhere near those boats because coaches don't play, and instead went to twitter.com to basically announce to the world that a new coup just dropped. Very quickly, the 2 boats lost contact with each other, one of the engines broke on the boats, and they were spotted by some fishermen who reported what was happening to the authorities, which led to the boat carrying 10 people being intercepted by Venezuelan authorities and a firefight breaking out, leading to everyone on the boat being killed or captured. When the other boat heard of this, they realized that it was very much over, leading them to either run into the mountains to regroup or getting captured by Venezuelan security forces themselves. The members that were captured had no body armor or camouflage, and the Green Berets that were captured were also carrying passports that identified them. After this, they then gave confessions in which they said that the United States was the mastermind of this glorious operation, which is a claim that the US of course denies. To this day, Jordan says that the operation was a good faith attempt at the liberation of Venezuela, which to me sounds a bit weird because he was in the army for a while, so he should have known that this plan wouldn't go well. In the end, Jordan got arrested for allegedly arms trafficking during the planning of the coup, as his DNA was found on some automatic rifles headed for South America. But before this, he had also sued Juan José Rendon for breach of contract, who was one of the original financial backers acting on behalf of the opposition. For his part, he doesn't deny wanting a revolution, but says that during the early days of the planning, he decided to cut ties with Jordan. The case is still ongoing, but from Jordan's testimony, he claims that both the US government and the Venezuelan opposition wanted him to keep going, and that's why he did, a claim which they both deny. Finally, the 2 Green Berets were also released in 2023 as part of a broader deal between Venezuela and the United States. Also, this isn't really mentioned anywhere, but apparently Eric Prince wanted to do this coup, but decided not to because he wanted way more money than the opposition was willing to give up. Eric denies this, but he also randomly posts about how nice a revolution in Venezuela would be on Twitter sometimes for some reason. The siege of Jadotville occurred during the Congo crisis, when Belgium left their colonial empire, and it immediately burst into a dumpster fire of roughly 1 bazillion people wanting independence. During this, UN peacekeepers were deployed in the region to maintain peace, with a small group of predominantly Irish soldiers being stationed in the mining town of Jadotville. To make a long story short, a group of Katangolese mercenaries, following orders from Western mercenary instructors, attacked the group of UN peacekeepers during mass, expecting them to be caught off guard. But then they noticed, and a warning shot was fired, and this eventually led to the siege of Jadotville. During this, roughly 3,000 mercenaries, assisted by close air support, fought against 156 entrenched UN forces. In the end, roughly 300 of the attacking side were dead, and another 1,000 were wounded. But as they were cut off from supplies and reinforcements, the peacekeepers did surrender.
So as you know, Wagner, and more broadly Russia, was doing some wacky things during the Syrian civil war, with a promise of getting that sweet, sweet oil money and an ally in return.
This led to potential conflict, considering that the United States was also in Syria, because you know what, I'm not going to recount the entire Syrian civil war to you, just to go over things very quickly. Nobody likes ISIL, in theory at least. Russia, the Wagner Group, Hezbollah, Iran, and Assad's government like each other. Turkey and kinda the US like the Free Syrian Army and some of their friends. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, are friends with America, who are there to stop ISIS and also try to stop Iranian weapons from being smuggled to their proxies. Anyway, past 2017, ISIL was not doing well, because as it turns out, attacking every permanent member of the UN Security Council, going off the idea that God wants me to win, is not a great long-term strategy. This eventually led to the Deir el-Zor campaign, where the SDF forced them out of the governorate, or province, of Deir el-Zor.
By 2018, the Syrian Democratic Forces controlled much of the Syrian territory east of the Euphrates River, which Russia and the United States basically agreed would be a de facto deconfliction line, basically making it so that a few 18 to 25-year-olds don't accidentally start a squad match and begin World War III.
This deconfliction line included the town of Qassam, and more importantly, the Conoco oil refinery on the SDF side, which was held by 1 SDF fighter and 30 Delta Force members. On February 7, 2018, around 250 Iranian-backed militia members tried to cross the river into the SDF side. Then the US showed up and fired a few warning shots to tell them to get back on their side, which they did, for a few hours, eventually crossing again in Marat with 500 troops, including Syrian fighters and members of the Wagner Group, armed with tanks, APCs, artillery, and various other weapons.
After this, they began to do the "we're definitely not gonna kill you" classic of acting out how they would kill them 1 mile from the refinery.
Then, by 10 p.m., they began to drive their vehicles to start the battle, beginning by using artillery on American and SDF positions. This led to a Predator drone that was watching them to destroy some of their positions with the weapons it had. At this point, American diplomatic channels were able to reach their Russian counterparts, who said that there weren't any Russian soldiers in the area, leading them to turn off some of their air defense systems, which allowed American air support to come into the area. This will be mildly inconvenient for Wagner very soon. I should also say that, by and large, the official Russian response to this event seemed dazed and confused, as to me it doesn't really make any sense why you would freely turn off your air defenses, assuming that you did know that your allies were in the area. A plausible reason for this is that Wagner didn't tell anyone, and instead wanted to get that previously mentioned oil money in a place they knew they really shouldn't be. But enough about the reasons. Let's see the proportional response that the United States used to stop their advance. During the battle, America used F-22 fighter jets, F-15 strike fighters, B-52 bombers, an AC-130 gunship, AH-64 attack helicopters, MQ-9 Reaper drones, M777 howitzers, and HIMARS rocket artillery.
The battle went poorly for the Wagner Group. Of course, for a conflict such as this, each side claims a different amount of casualties, with estimates ranging from 55 to 200.
Keeping in mind that most of the casualties are just government-aligned troops or militia fighters that were brought along for giggles. Also, the amount of Wagner troops killed is also heavily obscured because despite using all of the assets of the Russian government in Syria, they weren't officially Russian troops, so getting exact numbers is difficult. Also, they killed a journalist investigating the exact amount. Moving on the US side, none of the troops stationed at the base were killed or wounded, and the entire battle was a clear victory for the SDF and the United States.
Do you see Banana Man hopping over on the white hot sand?
This sounds like a joke, but it actually brings up an interesting point.
During the Russia-Ukraine war, a Somalian was captured by Ukrainian soldiers, at which point he was questioned by his captors on video and said that he was from Somalia and was in Ukraine for the money. After this, they gave him a banana and posted the photo online. By most accounts, this is pretty tame considering a lot of the legal protections for soldiers of fortune are near non-existent, and they did arrest someone who was complicit in one of the most brutal wars inflicted on their country. But some people said that this was racist. I'm not going to comment on this more than I already have, but to me this isn't the important part of the story. To me, this incident points out something else interesting, which is that Russia is expanding who is allowed to fight in their war, and they aren't just recruiting from people who are in their own country. A much larger example of this is North Korea being now an official combatant in the war, although they aren't really mercenaries, so I can't include them here. Also, this is sort of a side comment, but after the banana photo they posted became controversial, they posted another photo of him, with a pineapple.
On November 27, 2004, a Casa 212 operated by a subsidiary of Blackwater crashed into the Kowe-Baba Valley in Afghanistan.
During this time, Blackwater was contracted by the US Department of Defense to move troops and equipment in short flights across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan, usually between small airstrips. This particular flight took off from Bagram Air Base and was operated by 3 employees, who at that point were only in Afghanistan for 3 days. They were also carrying 3 passengers who were all part of the US Army and a bunch of mortar illumination rounds, with the mission to fly to Farah, where military personnel were based. After the flight began, instead of taking the normal route as they told air traffic control they would, they instead decided to go west and fly very low into a canyon. During this point, the voice recorder recorded the crew being unsure if they were in the correct valley, and then goofing off just a little bit, mentioning that they were having a lot of fun, with the co-pilot saying, "Yeah, you're an X-Wing fighter, Star Wars man," with the captain replying, "You're fucking right, This is fun. After this, they were discussing some of their previous mountain flying experiences, for which the captain said, "I swear to God, they wouldn't pay me if they knew how much fun this was. Can you see where this is going?" They then began to talk about what music they should play during the flight, but as they were near the end of the canyon, they quickly were getting to the point of finding out that so many of these stories have. At this point, they tried to turn around, but as the aircraft flaps deployed too late, the plane stalled and they crashed, killing everyone on board.
The crash was attributed to numerous pilot errors. Shocking, I know. Who could have guessed that going pod racing in Afghanistan might be dangerous?
Going over to the Iraq War now, Blackwater was also contracted for some resupply missions there, along with other jobs previously mentioned. These resupply missions often involved helicopters supplying the US government and other contractors in the area. That being said, not all PMCs liked each other, leading to an insane video of a Blackwater helicopter pulling off some Battlefield 4 strategies to annoy another group of contractors, flying really low and then flipping them off, effectively performing a helicopter teabag. It is wild to watch. I should say that there isn't much reliable evidence on what actually happened here. Some people say that it was a group of insurgents, but given that they don't immediately fire on the helicopter, the other story that it's a resupply mission makes more sense to me. That being said, no official reports on this incident seem to exist, so we might never know the full context here. It's a PMC that owns fighter jets, okay? Honestly, I only put them on this list because it's really cool. Right now, their only job is training and some search and rescue, but that's also how Blackwater started, and I'm really hoping in the future I can pay for some close air support to destroy my local Denny's. The private military company, Sandline, was a London-based PMC that mostly focused on helping governments fight against internal enemies in Africa. It was founded by Tim Spicer and Simon Mann. Mann was originally in the British SAS, but after leaving, he got into the oil business where he met businessman Tim Spicer. He was also trained in the military, and was a former partner with Executive Outcomes, another mercenary company. Then, rebels of the UNITA in Angola, quick side comment, terrible logo, please try a bit harder next time, seized the port and shut down its oil installations. So, Tim and Simon kind of decided that, instead of accepting geopolitical chaos as an acceptable loss of business in Africa, they would just go and get the oil running themselves by kicking the insurgents out, with their friends. Which they then did, with about 40 other people. They did this so well that the Angolan government convinced them to just do it full time, which then began the Sandline PMC. In 2005, Blackwater was given a contract of $243,000 per day to do security work in America during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, mostly protecting FEMA operations. They were really just rolling in the money back in the Bush era.
This story revolves around the First Punic War, so I'm just going to quickly go over the general points. Don't use this as a guide.
Basically, Rome was a kingdom which conquered most of the Italian peninsula, at which point they became a republic, and Carthage was a trading empire that controlled territory stretching from southern Spain down to Libya, including these funny little islands, oftentimes employing mercenaries to go to war. Originally, they were pretty good friends, but this changed with the first mercenary moment of this story, when a bunch of them, who were employed by Syracuse, were told that they weren't really needed anymore. To show their mild discomfort with this change in employment status, they occupied the city of Messana and murdered a bunch of its inhabitants, and then began doing raids into Syracuse.
After this, their now former employer began fighting back against them, and Carthage came and helped them out because they wanted to expand their influence on the island, and this was a convenient excuse. That being said, some of the mercenaries sent a letter to Rome asking them for help, which complicated things for them. So, TLDR, they decided to cross the strait and take the city, which then began the war. After some initial success in Sicily, Rome realized that it kind of wanted a few of these islands up here. Of course, this was difficult because Carthage. So, skipping forward a bit, eventually someone named Regulus was elected to consul and advocated for taking the war directly to Carthage.
After a huge naval battle, Regulus landed in Aspis with little resistance as Carthage's main strategy was to defend its capital. From this, he was able to push down towards Carthage, which caused even more chaos. So, how do you stop an advance such as this one? Yep, it's time for mercenary moment number 2. Xanthipus of Lacedaemon was given the task of stopping the advance, for which he excelled in, effectively using the terrain and the advantages of the Carthaginian military to defeat the Romans in the Battle of Tunis. During this battle, Carthaginian forces were able to capture Regulus, but After this, Xanthippus was then politely asked to leave, as having a really competent leader is sometimes awkward for some of the other leaders, for which he did, as they were the ones paying him.
Anyway, just for some really short history on how this ended, after Regulus was captured in the battle, he was sent back to Rome to try to convince them to go surrender, which he didn't do, instead encouraging them to keep fighting. So when he went back to Carthage, he was then tortured to death. After this, Rome made and lost 3 separate fleets, but the war was still going on after 20 years, which eventually made it so Carthage decided to start trading again in the Mediterranean. This then made it so Rome was able to take their last stronghold in Sicily, forcing them to surrender. During the negotiations, they got all of this land and also a ton of money. All in all, it was a pretty interesting war. I wonder if they'll make a sequel. Before starting this video, I was under the assumption that Wagner and Blackwater did not like each other. Although this assumption probably came from me playing a certain video game, some other things indicate that this may not be true.
To begin, Eric Prince did meet with Ukrainian officials at one point, offering them his services, but given his and his company's connections to actions the US government would rather not talk about, they decided to turn him down. But even with this, according to interviews, Eric Prince was once approached by members of the Russian government to help them create a PMC, even hanging out with members of the FSB in 2011. He said that he didn't give them any help, but according to him, this later became the Wagner Group. So this is what most people agree on. But later, in 2020, The Intercept reported that there was another connection between Eric and Wagner. According to them, Eric Prince met with Wagner and offered them his services, such as aerial surveillance in Libya and resupply missions in Mozambique after Wagner lost fighters there. This proposal was turned down by Wagner, but it still was a very risky decision for him to make, considering that at this point, Wagner was sanctioned by the US government. Although Eric adamantly denies that this ever happened, he still isn't shy about taking contracts from governments that the US may not see eye to eye with. An example of this is how he was the founder of Frontier Service Group, which is a Chinese-based company that focuses on logistics and security in Africa. In response to this article about the possible Wagner meeting, Eric Prince sued the publisher of The Intercept along with the 2 reporters for defamation. The lawsuit was thrown out, but Eric Prince still says that the story is false and that The Intercept is fake and run by, and I quote, an Iranian communist, because those are so easy to come by. To elaborate on why he said this, one of the main funding groups that helped start The Intercept was run by Pierre Omidyar, who had parents who were communist and Iranian, and that makes him the same. Another thing that I should mention is that Pierre Omidyar is the founder of eBay, so, workers of the world, sell your used stuff. Let's put a pin in this. In the People's Republic of China, government officials are appointed to the board of large companies. This includes Frontier Service Group. So, while Eric was calling this guy a communist, he was working with members of the Chinese Communist Party, who effectively allowed, or as some say, encouraged Frontier Service Group to act as mercenaries in Africa.
To finish this off, this is all just kind of to show that there isn't some my base to you sec against your barbarous bear private security, for the most part.
Grisha Putin is the name of a Russian Hearts of Iron streamer who became famous for streaming at Wagner Center in St. Petersburg on February 24, 2023. Before Russia's large-scale invasion in 2022, Grisha was still a Hearts of Iron streamer who frequently participated in tournaments in the game and was very active in the community. Then, as we know, a big invasion happened. From this, Grisha felt like he was pushed away from the Hearts of Iron community because, as he sees it, he was a nationalist for his country at a time it wasn't popular. Just as a side comment, he also denied the Butcha massacre, so maybe it wasn't only the Russia good takes that he had. Anyway, this is his Joker moment. So how did he perform his magnum opus of streaming in the Wagner Center? Well, basically he asked. The PMC Wagner Center just opened, so he went to the reception desk, told them that he was a streamer, and asked if he could stream in the building. After a background check, they said, sure, why not, and he began streaming. This exploded in popularity because that's a bit wacky, so he used this popularity to become a vocal online influencer for the Wagner Group, support Russia, and go to some events. One of these events was a gathering to support a pro-Russian military blogger who went by the name Vladimir Tartarsky. During this, he was given a golden head of himself, which happened to be packed with explosives that blew up, killing him. Grisha had left 30 minutes before, but his mom was still there and survived. After this, Prigozhin came to the spot where the bombing occurred 2 days later, which gave us this photo. Continuing on this story, he did seem quite sad when Prigozhin died. Although I should say, I don't think anyone really thought that absolutely nothing was going to happen to him. He attempted to commit treason, that usually doesn't go well. Nowadays, Grisha still plays Hearts of Iron and maintains his community called Z-Shaker Central, which raises money for Russian troops and civilians by allowing people to sign Russian artillery shells, similar to some Ukrainian fundraising projects. Also, he apparently now plays Hearts of Iron with coup diplomats from Burkina Faso. Wars in the 21st century are really weird. In March 2004, Seaman Man and another 69 people were arrested in Zimbabwe after guards at an airport noticed that they were carrying over $100,000 worth of weapons and equipment and another $180,000 in cash, with the goal of going to Equatorial Guinea to start a coup. Seaman Man tried to get out of the hot water by saying he was trying to do normal diamond protection in the DRC, but he was found guilty in Zimbabwe and sentenced to 7 years in jail, while 66 of the others were let go. Later, in 2004, Mark Thatcher, the son of Margaret Thatcher, was arrested in Cape Town for, as was stated in his plea deal, negligently supplying money to the coup. I genuinely do not know why he did that. Espanola is a Russian military formation which is made up of members of Russian soccer clubs, which is under the control of PMC Redet. The main mercenary moment of this is that they stole a lion during the Battle of Mariupol, which is now featured heavily in their propaganda. Along with this, two other things that I should mention is that one of their members is an MMA fighter with some tattoos that I don't think YouTube would like me describing, and the English media representative of the group is a man that goes by the name of Teddy Boy Greg, which I'm sure you can see is a very interesting character. I'm honestly not sure what I should point out from this photo. Every time I look back there's something else. I will point out that there's a combination Black Sun and Stalin patch because that proves to me that this is peak anti-centrism. J-Reg, your movement grows by the day. The backstory on him is that he was a barber who left for Russia a while back and seems to enjoy it there because Russia is protecting traditional European values or something. So yeah, that's Espanola. In 2007, two investigators had begun to write a government report about Blackwater's reckless conduct in Iraq. In this report, he discussed multiple problems that they found, accusing Blackwater of changing security for diplomats without the State Department's approval, carrying and storing weapons they weren't authorized to use, poorly maintaining their armored cars, having foreign workers live in poor working conditions, abusing alcohol, and partying with, quote, frequent female visitors. At one point, they even found that 4 Blackwater guards had gotten drunk and then stole and crashed a $180,000 armored car into a concrete barrier. Of course, some Blackwater employees got a bit concerned over the government report they were writing, considering that it may make it so they can't go on their experimental weapon Gunnar Bruce cruises anymore. So, when the two investigators, Jean Richter and Donald Thomas Jr., met with the Blackwater project manager in Iraq to discuss how one of their dining facilities was really dirty, he threatened to kill them, saying that he could kill them right now where they were sitting because they were in Iraq. So I guess he really didn't want to go cleaning that day. After the investigators told the State Department about this, the State Department sided with Blackwater, citing that the investigation had made their employees feel uncomfortable. So, both investigators left Iraq for the States, where Jean Richter finished his report, just weeks before the Nice War Square massacre occurred.
The Catalan Company was a group of mercenaries that existed around the 1300s. Because of how well known their previous expeditions were, they were hired by the Byzantine Empire, but mutual distrust between them eventually led them to go to war with their former employer and do a bit of trolling around what is now modern-day Greece. I know, mercenary moment.
After this, they were hired by the Duke of Athens, Walther of Brienne, to attack the ruler of Thessaly. So, they did. But then, Walther refused to pay them, and decided to instead take his own army to go kick them out of the region that they took for some soap opera logic reason. So, on March 15th, 1311, the mercenaries of the Catalan Company fought against their former employers, again, and won. After winning and realizing they still weren't getting paid, they decided to divide the duchy among themselves, effectively making a state that was conquered and owned by mercenaries.
This is also important for the history of the region, but we really don't have time right now. I'm looking at the video and it's over an hour long. Like, that's just too long. I don't know if I'll ever get this done. I think I'm speaking into the void right now.
The Truceless War was a rebellion of mercenaries that occurred shortly after the First Punic War, that started because of a payment dispute from mercenaries fighting for Carthage in Sicily. After Hamilcar Barca signed peace with the Romans and came back to the mainland, he he had to slowly ferry back the 20,000 mercenaries and conscripted forces that were still in Sicily so that they could finally be paid. When they started arriving, the leadership in Carthage kind of convinced everyone to delay the payment until everyone had arrived there. I mean, it wouldn't be fair, we're all in this together, don't worry bro, I'm totally good for it. After they all arrived, they started being annoying. So, the leadership of Carthage told them to all go on a little vacation to Sicca, which was a small town near the edge of what Carthage controlled. After this, Carthage then sent a delegate to convince everyone to take a pay cut, because shortchanging mercenaries is such a great idea, guys. It works every time. As you may have guessed, they didn't agree to this, and instead the mercenaries marched towards Carthage, set up camp in Tunis, and blocked off all the roads that connected them to the rest of the nation, where I presume they began to reenact the Jesse Pinkman Crack House episode intro, where's my money? Anyway, negotiations broke down and the leaders of the mini-rebellion got elected generals. Right as this happened, Libyan communities that were aggressively taxed and oppressed by Carthage rose up in support of them, leading to a total of 90,000 people fighting against the Carthaginian military. Because Hamilcar Barca had incredible military and diplomatic competence, and because he had plot armor so his son could eventually march elephants through the Alps, Carthage was victorious, and the leaders of the rebellion were crucified. What was Rome doing during this, I hear you ask? Surprisingly, Rome didn't support the rebels and banned doing trade with them. Although this not kicking someone when they're down didn't last long, because when Carthage put down another rebellion in Sardinia and its leaders went to Rome, they convinced them to invade, annexed all the territory, and also demanded more money from Carthage.
The Green Zone was a part of Baghdad that the US military maintained control over to try to keep the government of Iraq running after the initial invasion was over. We kind of discussed it earlier in this video, but that's what it is, just so we're all on the same page.
Inside this zone, as previously mentioned, were quite a few private contractors, but it was also the location that the coalition forces were stationed, and where the Iraqi government and Iraqi Prime Minister were located. On December 24, 2006, a Blackwater employee named Andrew Mooner was attending a party on Christmas Eve, at which point he got very drunk. After this, he left the party carrying his Glock and eventually made his way to the so-called Little Venice part of the Green Zone, where the Iraqi Prime Minister was staying. After he passed through a gate near the Prime Minister's compound, an on-duty guard confronted him. We don't know exactly what was said, but the interaction ended with Andrew shooting and killing the Iraqi guard. After this, he decided to show off his Chaz People's Police accountability by running away from the scene of the crime. He eventually got to another guard post that was operated by another PMC called Triple Canopy, at which point he told them that he got into a gunfight with Iraqi guards and that they were chasing him. At this point, the guards also recall him fumbling with the still loaded gun until one of them took it away from him and smelling of alcohol, but claiming to have not had any drinks. The day after this, Blackwater fired him citing breach of contract, because you're not meant to kill someone while drunk, especially if you're in a place that may cause an international incident. After this, he was flown out of Iraq, and then other Blackwater employees asked the US attorney to prosecute him because of how bad it made their company look. In the end, the US State Department apologized to the family of the guard killed and gave them a bit of money. But despite other Blackwater employees asking for charges to be brought against him, in 2010 they decided to close the investigation and declined to prosecute him. The reason that they gave for deciding not to prosecute him is that it could have been self-defense, and they don't think there was sufficient evidence to convict him, which I guess is true, but I think that if there was a belief that it was self-defense, there would have been more pushback from other contractors, which didn't happen in this example. Of course, we would be able to get a more accurate story if the charges were brought against him, but again, that didn't happen.
Oh, yes. Yes, very nice. It's drip or drown season, boys, and I intend to be swimming. I like to call this little section of video conspiracy tier. But despite its name, all of the things I'm going to talk about have some basis in reality. I will, at times, speculate over certain things, but I've decided to wear this little hat to let you know what is not backed up by fact and what is. PMCs versus polar bears. I hear Ryan Gosling plays a starving polar bear in this one.
Because of tourism, financial, and scientific expeditions, the need for security from polar bears in the Arctic has greatly increased, leading to some PMCs filling that role. One of the most publicized examples of this that you may have seen online was during the Mosaic expedition, which was a year-long international research expedition that sought to check in how climate change was affecting the Arctic. Of course, they needed some security from polar bears while doing this, so they brought along some heavily armed security personnel to protect the scientists, which gave us some of the hardest pictures of all time. Along with this, very recently, a Russian oil drilling company, Gazprom Neft, created 3 different PMCs after getting permission from the Russian Prime Minister, named Potok PMC, Vakul PMC, and Pamlyap PMC. Just to go over these, this is Potok PMC's logo. I don't think I could make a more stalker-like logo if I tried. They've also fought in Ukraine, which is a bit of a weird diversification strategy, but considering that the entire economy of Russia is kind of based on war right now, it's not that surprising. Just as a side tangent about Gazprom Neft, if I had to choose a company that I wouldn't be surprised to hear was fighting mythological creatures in the Arctic, it would be them. And I think the main reason that I feel that is because of their main headquarters lacked a center. Just hear me out, okay? It is the tallest building in Europe, but there also aren't any other skyscrapers around it, with the main notable thing that's near it being the 3 tallest flags of Russia. You know, the I'm not ashamed of my past ones that people on Twitter sometimes post. On the inside, if you go to the 88th floor, there is a statue of the guardian angel of St. Petersburg, surrounded by what looks like a real-life M.C. Escher painting. Also, they're planning to build an even taller one right next to it, which, from its initial design, will look even more wacky. To me, the entire place feels like a movie set. It doesn't look bad, it's just every photo I see of it feels weird, and I don't know how to describe it, so now I have to show you. Sorry for the side tangent. Going back to their PMCs, when Wagner was still a large group in Ukraine, Prigozhin frequently saw them as competition, and seemed to really dislike them.
In reality, these groups probably exist because energy infrastructure has been targeted throughout the war on both sides, and also Gazprom Neft is more loyal to Putin than some other groups. But there might be another reason for wanting PMCs near the Arctic.
The Iceberg is a shape-shifting creature of Inuit culture that is often depicted as having sideways eyes and mouth. It is often said to kidnap, hide, and then abandon children. Okay, we're not going to do this anymore. That's why they have PMCs in the Arctic, okay? So, the Battle of Qassam happened, and it wasn't particularly good for Wagner. But because of how secretive the organization was at the time, official death counts, or exactly what happened from their perspective, were difficult to come by. Because of this, a Russian journalist named Maxim Baradin decided to write about the engagement by both interviewing relatives and commanders of those killed, and also attending some of their funerals to get a better idea of how many people died. At this time, he was a moderately well-known journalist in Russia, and had investigated and wrote about corruption, prisons, monarchist organizations, and some political scandals. But the story he was writing about Wagner was his last. On April 11th, 2018, Baradin noticed armed men wearing camouflage outside his apartment, at which point he told a friend. But then he called them back and said that it was all okay, and he's pretty sure they were just training. This could also be because he wasn't new to intimidation. He was beaten in 2017 for reporting on the previously mentioned monarchist organizations, and had also received death threats because of other pieces of his work. But on the next day, April 12th, he fell out of his window and went into a coma, later dying of his injuries on the 15th of April, 2018. Officially, the reason given for his death was that he went for a smoke near his window and then fell. An investigation was completed which, surprise surprise, found no evidence of anything other than the official story. A few months after this, 3 more Russian journalists who were investigating Wagner in the Central African Republic were also killed, this time via an ambush. The official explanation for their deaths is that they got a bit too close to a local militia, which I guess could have happened, but it also happened right after Maxim was killed. Got into the extreme sport of going for a smoke.
This is all to say, within the span of a few months, 4 different journalists, all doing investigations into one private military company, were all killed under suspicious circumstances. I sure wonder why. Also, I didn't put on the hat for any of this. This is all just fact. G4S is a private security company based out of the United Kingdom, which has quite a few different controversies.
The reason that I haven't put them on this list yet is because I don't think they meet the same criteria for a PMC or a mercenary as the other ones, and I feel that if I did include them, then the door opens for every story about a university guard getting drunk to be included in this list. That being said, I still feel like some of G4S's contracts could be seen as PMC work, So instead of going through them one by one and deciding what is and isn't, as a compromise, I'll just quickly cover some of their more notable moments here. First, in 2012, they were contracted by the UK government to provide security for the Olympics. Then they realized, 1 month before the games started, that they didn't recruit enough people, meaning that the military had to go down to the stadiums and act as security. Second, and also third, while providing some security services for prisons in South Africa, they were accused of torturing prisoners in 2013, which seems to be true. Then, in 2022, G4S Correctional Services in South Africa said that a serial rapist and murderer had blown himself up in prison as a suicide. It was later found that he had not done this, and had instead escaped prison with help from G4S contractors. After this news story broke, he was arrested in Tanzania while attempting to cross the border into Kenya. Fourth, in 2016, while G4S was working with Lincolnshire Police as operators, it turned out that employees were calling the police station themselves to try to improve call answering data. Of course, the people doing this were quickly fired.
And finally, G4S killed General Qassam Soleimani.
I mean, they didn't, but a random Iranian prosecutor basically said so. The theory goes that because G4S was protecting the airport that he was killed in, when they saw him, they called up the US and called in a drone strike. Of course, he didn't provide any evidence for this, and let's face it, I don't think a country that spends $60 billion on intelligence needs a tip from guards at an airport.
I pointed tourists in the wrong direction. I rigged the 2020 election.
In 2022, some comments of Yevgeny Prigozhin were posted by his catering service on Russian social media VKontakte, saying that he had interfered with the US elections and that he planned to do so in the future in a very surgical way, going on to mention that, during our pinpoint operations, we will remove both kidneys and the liver at once. He didn't elaborate on whatever that means, but I don't think it's a good sign. Anyway, was he the main reason for whatever primary color you don't like winning in 2020 or 24? Probably not. But given that powerful countries frequently try to interfere in elections, whether they're doing so through beanies, balaclavas, or berets, it's not surprising that an invisible extension on one of those governments probably got in on the action.
Now for the final part of Conspiracy Tier. Prigozhin is alive. I saw him on the bus yesterday, and he was like, "Why are you filming me? Please stop." And I was like, "I can handle the truth." Okay, so he is actually probably dead. But while doing research into that death, it does kind of seem a bit weird how he died.
Just to reiterate, he was the leader of an incredibly powerful mercenary company in Russia that started a coup that he quickly called off for some reason. Then he went to Africa, knowing full well that his country takes out people for doing much less than treason, and then when he was called back to Russia, he just went. To add to the strangeness, just before that fateful flight, he also released a video in which he seems to have completely forgotten about what he did. Also, if you were a high-profile individual that wanted to fake their death, then it would make sense to want a body double to be burned beyond recognition, like in a plane crash. And with this, I doubt Russian authorities assigned to the case did a particularly thorough investigation to triple-check that the corpse they found was him.
So the question then arises, what if he wasn't on that plane? What if that was the deal given to him so that he could actually retire from what he's worked for? Or what if he intentionally didn't get on the plane to test what the Russian government would do?
This is also interesting, considering that in 2019, Russian media reported that Prigozhin may have died in a military plane crash in the DRC, a crash which it was later discovered he was never on. This is all to say that he now waits in one of his hundreds of black sites in warlord states with his billions in ill-gotten gains, waiting for the chance to strike back at the heart of the traitors who had the foolishness to make a cowardly attempt on his life and who would dare oppose the holy mandate of...
Or maybe he just wasn't as smart as some people say he was. Probably one of those options. Also, I was considering putting this part in a different section, but I'll just put it here. The Russian government did an investigation into what happened to Prigozhin's plane, and guess what? They found themselves innocent.
But their reason for this crash is also pretty great. They say that while coming back from their little vacation in Africa, Prigozhin and his comrades got a little bit drunk, and then also did a little bit of cocaine, and while in this state, they started tossing grenades around, and then someone accidentally activated one, and it blew up, which killed them all. This is by far the funniest possible way that they could have gone out. And because of that, although I don't believe anything that the Russian government says, I really want to believe this. Also, if this is true, then they probably used one of the two most common types of Russian grenades, either the RGD-5 or the F1. This is important because those two common types of grenades both make a loud when activated, meaning that, assuming this actually happened, the fucking around part of cocaine grenade juggling transitioned at a rapid speed to the finding out part.
That being said, the investigation was a conflict of interest from the start, and the investigators even denied getting help from the company that manufactured the airplane during the investigation. The actual reason why the plane crashed was either external sabotage to the plane or an explosive planted on board. So, surprisingly, it wasn't a surface-to-air missile this time. That part of the ad was misinformation. My bad. Sealand is an unrecognized country off the coast of the United Kingdom.
It was originally a naval fort made by the British in World War II, but after the war it was abandoned and taken over by a pirate radio station, basically people who wanted to start a radio station without a license. It was then taken over by Paddy Roy Bates in 1967, who kicked out the original pirate radio operators, intending to start his own pirate radio. But then, instead of doing that, he declared independence as the Principality of Sealand, declaring himself leader and giving himself the title Prince Roy.
Of course, I would say that Sealand isn't a real country. And I know there isn't a definition of what a country is, but by royal decree of me not playing mind games, it's probably fake. That is, if mercenaries didn't try to take it over in the 1970s.
Alexander Achenbach was a German diamond dealer and lawyer who became a citizen of the nation in 1975, and is very important to the story of Sealand. He helped write the Constitution and eventually declared himself Prime Minister, but he had bigger plans for the island. Not to invade London or anything, more just hotels and gambling. With this in mind, Prince Roy and Achenbach discussed the sale of Sealand to himself and some investors, because apparently some investors were just willing to throw money at anything at this point. But Roy Bates decided against the sale, because it differed greatly from the vision that he had for his glorious principality. Because this deal fell through, Alexander decided to hire German and Dutch mercenaries to attack the micronation. At the start, this was very successful, considering that they only had to take something the size of a football field, and they also took Prince Roy Bates' son, Michael Bates, as a POW for 3 days. Or, a hostage if you don't see it as a real country. After that, Michael Bates was forced off the nation on a ship that landed in the Netherlands. When he got off, he and his dad, who was in Austria at the time after being lied to by Alexander, made their way back to the UK, got a bunch of friends together, and then flew back to Sealand on a helicopter and retook their country. So, just for those keeping score, in the upcoming movie Mercenaries vs. Real Sealander Patriots, the Patriots will win. Anyway, after the battle to retake Sealand ended in a decisive Sealandian victory, the mercenaries were sent back to their country as is required by the Geneva Convention. But as Achenbach had a Sealand passport, they decided to instead try him for treason, sentencing him to death by firing squad. I'm joking, okay? But after everything else being true, I was ready to read that line, and let's face it, you were too. Also, Prince Roy did consider it. What actually happened is he was tried, found guilty, and put into jail in Sealand, only to be released if 75,000 Deutschmarks were paid. During this, Germany asked the UK to go get him out, but the UK basically said that they didn't want to be involved in whatever IRL pull and ball Discord server was happening just off their coast. This led to Germany, who Achenbach was still a citizen of, to send a diplomat from their London embassy to Sealand to try to release him.
When the diplomat arrived, Prince Roy Bates decided to release him, as he considered this de facto recognition from Germany. After this, Achenbach decided to proclaim a government in exile, also known as the Sealand Rebel Government. Thomas Michael Hoare, also known as Mad Mike or Mad Mike Hoare, is the name of a British military officer turned mercenary who had a long and distinguished career across Africa.
His interesting career starts at age 20 when he joined the British Army and fought in World War II, fighting against the Japanese Empire in Burma and India. After World War II, he married, had 3 kids, and became an accountant. He found this boring, so in 1948, he moved to South Africa where he took some tourists on hunting safaris to earn money. That is, until he realized that he was in Africa during a time when some people might be willing to pay a few dollars for a former World War II trained major in the British Army. So, he got into the employment field that this video is based on, fighting for Tshomi and his breakaway government in the early 1960s. When that crisis was over, he was rehired by the now Prime Minister to create a mercenary group of about 300 men to put down the Simba Rebellion. This was also the point that he hired Siegfried Müller, meaning that he's the reason for Congo Miller getting his name. It's really nice to see how closely knit the Soldiers of Fortune community is. War can really bring people together.
Anyway, the group he commanded, known as Commando 5, was alleged to have substantial racist views, which is probably true considering who he was hiring from. He denied committing atrocities upon the local population, but other observers say that he and his group didn't have a particularly strong set of guidelines on who was and wasn't a combatant, and other quotes from him make it seem like he didn't particularly care.
Despite his group clearly fitting any reasonable definition of mercenary, he denied that they were, saying that they were instead volunteers, that the money didn't matter, and that he and his men were instead doing it for the simple love of the game. Just to skim over some of the more mercenary momenty things that he and his group did, his mercenaries teamed up with some other groups to save a bunch of Europeans and missionaries who were taken hostage in Stanleyville, at which point his men also looted the city. His group was accused of stealing things from the UN, who were also there, which is kind of funny to me, and a movie was eventually made about them, which he really liked. In the end, he made his way back to South Africa to retire. That is, until someone offered him one final job.
This story also involves Mike Hoare, but his thing was too long, so we now have two sections.
In 1977, Frans Albert Rene, the Prime Minister of Seychelles, promoted himself to president through a mini coup, while the now ex-president, James Mackham, was out of the country. Long story short, in 1981, some Seychelles exiles, who were supported by South Africa, decided that it was a quarter-past coup because the previous American coup plot to get rid of the previous coup president was exposed. From this, they needed a leader to take down the government. So they contacted who else but Mad Mike Hoare. At this point, Hoare got together 54 men and himself and prepared the plan. It was simple. 9 members of the team would go to the islands first, find targets, and rally support of dissident soldiers. After that, the rest of the team would get into the country by pretending to be a rugby club that was distributing toys to underprivileged kids, while also transporting rifles beneath said toys in their luggage.
After this, they would wait at a few different hotels until Rene held a cabinet meeting, at which point they would seize the parliament, the police station, the army barracks, the radio station, standard coup stuff.
When the rugby team arrived at the international airport, 41 of the 43 members got through customs and were ready to begin the waiting stage. But then, one of the last members accidentally joined the something to declare line. After this, a customs inspector opened the bag, at which point he found a rifle that he was trying to smuggle in. This made the mercenaries realize that they no longer had the element of surprise, so they just started blasting. That one little oopsie-daisy led to a 6-hour gunfight at the airport, during which the mercenaries tried to continue the coup with an unsuccessful attempt to capture a barracks. After this, the Seychelles government ordered the military to retake the airport, which they tried to do by driving 2 armored vehicles onto the airstrip, at which point the mercenaries shot at the tires of the armored vehicles and lit one on fire with a Molotov. While all of this was going on, Air India Flight 224 was flying to mainland Africa and needed refueling. At this point, the mercenaries had taken control of the control tower, and so gave the flight permission to land, because at this point, what did they have to lose? After a failed attempt by the government to stop this, they fired on the plane as it landed, assuming that it was carrying more mercenaries. Then, the mercenaries hijacked the plane and got the pilot to fly to South Africa. In the aftermath of this, 5 members of the team already in the country were arrested, and 4 were originally sentenced to death, but negotiations with South Africa made it so that they were just deported in mid-1983. When Mike Hoare and his group arrived in South Africa, they were all arrested, not because coups are bad, but because hijacking is bad.
The mercenaries were convicted of hijacking, yet most of them served only 3 months of their 6-month prison sentence. Mike Hoare was sentenced to 10 years in prison for masterminding the operation, yet he only served 3 years of that 10-year sentence.
The people who suffered most in this story is the 1 Seychelles soldier killed, the 1 police officer injured, the 1 mercenary who died, and the 2 mercenaries who were injured in the fighting. But considering it was Mike Hoare and his mercenaries who instigated the violence, everyone seemed to luck out of persecution remarkably well. In conclusion, make sure you're in the right line if you're doing a coup.
This section is a catch-all for all the times that drug cartels have interacted with mercenaries in some way. Essentially, because wheeling and dealing is so profitable, a lot of drug cartels have enough money to basically buy or do whatever they want. Colombia now has a hippo problem because of that, but that's beyond the point.
This also means that sometimes these organizations use that money to hire people who are informed in military strategy or tactics. often hiring deserters from South American militaries, but sometimes hitting up good old PMCs. There are quite a few examples of this, which is why I made it a catch-all, but for this tier, I think I'm going to focus on a very clear example. That being when the Cali cartel hired a group of mercenaries to go and kill Pablo Escobar.
We don't have time to get into the entire Colombian narco-terror war, but essentially, the Cali cartel was a brutal drug-dealing cartel that were enemies with Pablo Escobar, and the Colombian military was fighting off leftist insurgencies, some of which were getting some IRL Twitch donations from Pablo's cartel. Also, Los Pepes was getting money from the Cali cartel, which, despite its name, wasn't there to find Lost Pepes. I was disappointed, but was made up of people who were persecuted by Pablo Escobar's cartel and were waging a guerrilla war against him.
While Pablo Escobar was waging his war against the government, he hired an assassin to go and kill one of the founders of Los Pepes. The assassin opened fire at him at a sporting event, which, although didn't kill him, made the Cali cartel annoyed. After this, they found a civil engineer called Jorge Salcedo Cabiera, who in the past had hired mercenaries to fight against the previously mentioned leftist insurgencies. He agreed to help them, for money, and got together some mercenaries who then began training. They then got intelligence that Pablo Escobar was staying at a compound because the football team he liked had won a tournament. So they got in 2 heavily armed helicopters that they painted to look like police helicopters to spread confusion, and took off early in the morning to catch them off guard. After this, one of the helicopters crashed into a side of a mountain, which killed the pilot, and the other group had to abort the mission. A bit after this, Pablo got arrested and was sent to prison where he was still able to run his cartel. But the Cali cartel wasn't going to give up on their dreams after one failed try. The second plan they came up with was to bomb the prison he was staying in with an A-37 jet bomber with 4 500-pound bombs they bought from a corrupt general in El Salvador. But this idea also came with some problems. When Salcedo arrived in El Salvador to pick up the bombs, he realized that they only took a small private jet to take the bombs back to Colombia. Nonetheless, they took 20 minutes attempting to load the bombs in, stopping after only managing to load in 3, and then abandoning the last one on the runway because a crowd of people was beginning to form, wondering why someone was trying to load a Helldiver's call-in into a private jet. But even after this, they couldn't go through with the plan because witnesses had told other people of what they saw, which made it so it eventually got onto the news, and then some members of the second plan even admitted what they were doing to the media. Anyway, these 2 misadventures made it so that Jorge Salcedo Cabiera became a known criminal, which eventually led him to becoming an informant for the DEA, at which point he was relocated to the US.
Later, in 1993, Pablo Escobar was shot during an attempted arrest, and then Colombia lived happily ever after with no drug-related problems whatsoever. The end.
This one is kinda self-explanatory. Members of the once Wagner group have been hired to fight against the forces of Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony, trying to do what multiple government attacks, UN fanfiction insanity, and Kony 2012 all tried to do. Of course, because of the previously mentioned things, Kony's forces are pretty fragmented and shrinking, so I doubt we'll get any shocking revelations. The Indonesian National Army, often abbreviated as just TNI, is acting as an army for hire in West Papua.
The Free Papua movement, often just abbreviated as OPM, is an independence movement seeking to gain an independent state in what is now Western New Guinea. I'm not going to say whether they're good or bad, or talk about the history of the region. For the same reason, I'm not going to talk about why a plant made an entire subcontinent into a PvP area.
Anyway, Freeport Indonesia, which is operated by Freeport McMoran, is a mining company which operates in Western New Guinea, and in 1976 got a few letters from OPM talking about an uprising and demanding that they help them. The company refused because they don't get paid enough for this, and so the OPM carried out sabotage against the company in retaliation, which began the conflict between the two. This problem continued into the 1980s, at which point the company requested help from the government to protect their assets. This relationship eventually led to Freeport Indonesia paying for a lot of the expenses that TNI got from protecting their assets, which, to me, kinda sounds like a regular military doing PMC work on the side to pay rent.
This relationship has continued as recently as 2023. And although they make it difficult to understand what's occurring in their internal documents, I've decided to translate a section because I am semi-fluent in corporo speak. Synergy. Touch base leverage.
Basically, they say that they're spending $25 million to do a lot of the things that a government should be doing for the military, and in return, they secure an area of operations for their mining locations, with their justification being that they're doing this to protect their employees and for no other reason. Of course, from their perspective, this is just a necessary action that they have to take, so it's not the craziest thing on this list. But I do find it interesting that instead of going to one of the hundreds of security companies like almost any other company would, they instead decided to use the government. You can never half-coup a government. If it looks like a coup to everyone else, then the only two options are total victory or humiliating defeat. Ironically, Russians usually know this better than most, considering that the Soviet hardliner half-coup of 1991 was the reason that shocked many of the republics of the USSR to leave, but alas, Prigozhin still tried. After the failure of the Wagner convoy and Prigozhin's death, an entirely new chain of control over Russia's PMC operations in Africa, Ukraine, and the Middle East has been created. Most of Wagner's contracts have been taken over by PMC Reda, which was one of their main competitors and has a much stronger link to the Russian central government. One example of this being them offering Wagner's PMCs in Africa jobs doing the exact same thing, just under a different name. Along with that, in 2024, many of Wagner's operations in Africa were merged into the new Africa Corps. They probably should have done one Yandex search before choosing that name, but who cares? Which is under direct control of the Russian MOD, although some just regard the Africa Corps as nothing but a PMC department of the Russian MOD. Finally, in Ukraine, although some are still fighting under Wagner's name, many have left either for the Russian military or smaller PMCs. Despite this, Wagner still exists, and is being run by Pavel Prigozhin, the son of Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Before their Rush-Moscow order, the Wagner Group had also engaged in making movies, one of which was called Tourist, and was based in the Central African Republic and discussed the Wagner Group helping out the military there. It, in my opinion, it's not that great.
That being said, the other movie, Best in Hell, is much better. It revolves around a military operation between an attacking group and a defending group over a few blocks of buildings. The main message of the movie seems to be that the conflict in the film, which, although they don't ever mention by name, is clearly meant to be the Russia-Ukraine war, is a war between brothers, with a few ideas about how great Russia is sprinkled in, because at the end of the day, it's still a propaganda film. Its laces of propaganda are unfortunate, because I feel like with a few small changes, more likable characters, more realistic tactical decisions, more low periods between fights instead of non-stop action, this could be a pretty good anti-war movie, especially considering that one of the main actors in it is the same actor from Come and See, which is one of the best anti-war movies ever made. That being said, the Russian Federation isn't big on anyone being anti-war right now, so who knows? Maybe in another universe. The writer of this film wrote it after recovering from injuries he sustained while fighting in Ukraine. Then, after he recovered, he died, fighting near Bakhmut, which is why many see this depiction of war as so realistic.
The final thing to note about this movie is the title of the movie, Best in Hell, was referenced by Prigozhin when he was talking to some of his fighters, saying that, "We will all go to hell, but we'll be the best in hell." This was also posted to his Telegram the day that he died. The Sandline Affair was a political crisis in Papua New Guinea that culminated in a near-military revolt after the government considered using Sandline mercenaries to put down the Bougainville conflict.
Long story short, there was a big copper mine in the Bougainville region of Papua New Guinea, so it started to get mined, but the residents of Bougainville weren't big fans of the foreign workers and companies being employed there, or the environmental consequences. Then, in 1988, violence began on the island. The military was quickly called in to crush it, but this quickly developed into a separatist insurgency. The insurgency lasted for 10 years, until the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Julius Chan, decided that it was time to employ mercenaries to deal with the conflict, and recapture the largest mine on the island. This intention to hire mercenaries was leaked to the Australian press, which became a problem for the government, as at this point, everyone kind of wanted a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The Australian and New Zealand government both didn't support using mercenaries to solve the issue, and of course, war is lay bad. This then began the Sandline Affair, during which the leader of Papua New Guinea's defense forces, Jerry Singarock, said that he did not support the plan and ordered any mercenaries to be detained when they arrived. This then led to a point where the country was very close to a military coup, as protesters and the military surrounded the country's parliament. After this, the Prime Minister cancelled the contract and resigned from his position. This conflict then ended with peace talks held by a new Prime Minister in New Zealand, where an autonomous republic was created. Then, later, a non-binding referendum was created asking if they wanted independence, which they voted for, meaning that they should be independent at some point in the future. After the Bosnian War, the US hired DINCorp to train police and advise the UN mission in Bosnia. In the 1990s, a former DINCorp mechanic, Ben Johnson, and a UN monitor who was hired under DINCorp, Catherine Bolevuk, independently alleged that DINCorp, the United Nations Police, and other international groups were engaging in the rape and human trafficking of minors, all of which had substantial evidence to suggest they were telling the truth. After this was revealed, Catherine was fired from DINCorp, allegedly for time card fraud, although she sued them in the UK for wrongful termination and won, as she was a whistleblower, and this was likely retaliation. Many of the employees of DINCorp were forced to resign. Yet, when they got back to their countries, none of them were prosecuted for the evil they committed.
What is the next step of the operation?
Ants use mercenaries, because apparently the devs just randomly add stuff sometimes in this game.
This was found when researchers were studying the relationship between the Sericomyrmex ant, which farms fungus, and the parasitic Megalomyrmex ant, which eats a significant amount of what the other ant creates. While doing this, researchers found that this combination of parasitic and host ant were incredibly common, while other parasitic ants were not. Knowing this, researchers decided to expose another parasitic ant called Naptogenus to one of their farming colonies that already had the Megalomyrmex ant in it. But when they did this, instead of the colony being destroyed, as unprotected farming colonies usually would, the farming ants hid in the tunnels, while the parasitic ants fought back against the attackers, which means that the Megalomyrmex ant takes much of what the farming ants produce in good times in exchange for protection. From this fact, it was interpreted that they act as ant mercenaries, as that's often what mercenaries did in medieval cities, as they would make things more difficult when times were good, but would defend the city when times were bad. Also, I feel like I should add that ants apparently do a lot of things that it seems like only humans should be able to do, like farming, or having wars and roaming armies, or owning slaves. Also, they have some The Last of Us zombie stuff going on in Rainforest. It's kind of concerning to me how they're doing this all without our consent, but hey, you do you, you wacky little family of insects. Eric Prince has been contracted by the Haitian government to use FPV suicide drones to fight against the brutal gangs that control much of Haiti. Sometimes I write down a sentence and I don't realize how terrifying it is until I say it out loud, man. This is...
Congratulations.
In this video, we have talked quite a bit about mercenaries, and have dabbled into the shenanigans of jihadists. So, the question arises, what if we combine them? Here at Jihad Express, we believe in destroying the imperialist forces of the West through a foundation of corporate social responsibility. This was kind of the idea behind Malhama Tactical, a group that became noticed in 2017 as they were jihadist military contractors that advertised to and trained other jihadist groups. In the beginning, they were only training people as that was their business, but then they adopted more combat operations after their founder was killed in 2019. Despite being based in Syria, they did not and do not do business with any ISIS-affiliated groups, as everyone hates them. But one of their main customers in Syria turned out to be Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. You know, the guys who now run Syria. Do you remember Silvercorp? Way back in Tier 4, I briefly talked about them in Operation Gideon. They were the company that was set up by a former Green Beret who eventually tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government. What I learned from doing research is that was not their original business plan. Their original business plan was 21 Jump Street, but for mass shooters. Basically, after the Stoneman Douglas shooting, he showed up to a school safety conference in Orlando and suggested that former Special Forces operators be put into school pretending to be teachers so that when the next loser comes to have his search history read in court, the school is now a 1v1 Call of Duty map. In that same meeting, he said that he didn't know what they would teach, as those events are pretty rare, so for the rest of the time they would have to be doing something. But he did know how they would pay for them, saying that he would charge each parent $8.99 a month, going on to say that the beauty of it is it's all for the price of a Netflix subscription.
Of course, this business plan didn't really pan out, so then his company began training schools on how to respond to those situations, and then he began doing coup d'etats.
Well, there we are. The Mercenary Moment iceberg chart. I'm glad there isn't any more.
Y'all ever play Tarkov? You didn't answer me the last time, so this is more of a demand. Also, before we get into that, here's a quick list of dishonorable mentions.
Contract Wars was a game developed by Battlestate Games that is kind of a prequel to Escape from Tarkov. It revolves around the events of the Novarinsk region, where USEC and Bear PMCs fight each other. I'm not going to give a full review of the game, as it went offline in 2018, which is probably for the best, and also I didn't play it. But it does bring up an interesting idea of warfare, where neither party is an official state combatant. In this style of warfare, although each side is clearly funded by a state, they never declare war on each other, and the loyalty each side has to each state remains solely for financial or political gain, meaning that losses can be covered up and successes can be made without ever being reported. Of course, the implication that Wagner, Blackwater, or executive outcomes may be directly fighting each other is a bit of a leap, right? I agree, until you realize that many paramilitaries often do things that could be seen as PMC work on the side. There are many cases of this, but to use the Syrian civil war as an example, Hezbollah helped fight for the Assad regime to try to keep their guns coming through a friendly state. The Free Syrian Army and HTS were kept fighting by Turkey to weaken an enemy and prevent a future problem, and of course the SDF kept control of oil fields for the benefit of the United States. All of these groups did it for their own reasons, but while doing so, they made decisions that helped one side, fighting as mercenaries in a global proxy war that began before many of us were even alive. This style of warfare, that often goes unreported, exists, and it's escalating. The Cold War has put shackles on superpowers that they cannot shake off even after the Eastern Bloc collapsed. If America ever directly fights Russia or China, things have gone very wrong. So instead of doing that, they pay young men to go and fight for them indirectly, with them being known as freedom fighters or terrorists or mercenaries. America is not naive to the crimes their PMCs have committed in Iraq, just as Russia is not unaware of the evils their paramilitaries have committed in Ukraine, just as China is not just learning that their security in Africa is acting as de facto militaries. They all know, they just don't care. And this is not a mistake or an accident, it's by design. Just as many PMCs hire former military officials for groundwork, many also hire retired commanding personnel that both make them more effective and can also act as de facto lobbyists for the governments that are their largest clients. When America can't initiate a draft to clean up their wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, they hired PMCs. When Russia needs to beat protesters as they try to expand their empire, they pay street gangs to fight for them. And when those under-the-table armies commit a crime, there's no way to effectively prosecute them, as doing so would be admitting that they are under your control, and any state that employs them can never admit that. You may still have doubts over this, but don't take it from me. Eric Prince wrote in his book, Civilian Warriors, that, quote, "There is much the government doesn't want told about the work we did. The truth about our State Department-sanctioned operational tactics in Iraq, for instance, including our rules of engagement, or Blackwater's crucial involvement with President Obama's ever-expanding terrorist hunting tactics in Pakistan and beyond, or even the depth of government reliance on contractors today, and the outsourcing of its war machine. Government agencies don't want that spotlight being shown on our work, nor to applaud the greatest advantage Blackwater offered them, increased capability. They want increased deniability. If you look for examples of this, you can find them. Wagner troops get assaulted by Islamists who are assisted by the Ukrainian government in Africa, or the Russian government paying money to the Taliban to hunt down Americans, or Ukrainian special forces fighting Wagner in the Sudanese civil war, or even the Battle of Qassam. This is all to say, regardless of what a group calls themselves, as all these examples show, the contract wars are real.
Welcome to the real end of the video. You can now take this information and go concern people at parties. That is my gift to you.
This outro is going to be similar to the last one, where it was a quick outro spliced in between other things. But for this one, I'm going to do what I think would have happened if Prigozhin was a bit more lucky, because I still haven't gotten over that. I'm not going to have any voiceover, but if you would like to pause, you definitely can. Anyway, let's begin. Thank you for watching and liking or disliking and commenting in the previous video I made. To be honest, I didn't expect the last video to do that well, and it was really nice when it did, so truly thank you. Also, some of your comments were pretty funny, so good job. If you guys want, I do have a Twitter account where I post semi-frequently. Last video, someone asked me if I was going to make a Discord server, and although I would like to do that, I think I'm going to wait a bit before that. I've been in Discord servers that only have like 7 people, and it starts off fun, posting memes, discussing videos, and leaking NATO documents, but after a week or two, it's just someone saying, "Wow, it's dead in here," and journalists asking for an interview. TLDR, I may, or may not, create one in the future. But if you want something now, find me on Weimar Republic Bird app.
In conclusion, them PMCs sure are wacky sometimes. New video coming when it's ready. Until I see you again, hope you have a good one.